And this is an intentional thing. Obviously, you can just simply go ahead and write when you start to write an article, but there actually should be some thinking that goes ahead of that, who you're writing for. And that's seems like a simple concept, but actually, for some, it doesn't come naturally. Thinking about the reader before you actually start writing. And we're going to see today that can be a key to an article's success. All right, so just to remind you where we are, we had an introduction to this course, and last week we focused a lot on the most common errors, and I wanted to get that off the table. I wanted to focus on grammar because I know that it's the elephant in the room. Everybody's thinking about it, and I wanted you to give you the tools so that you can not think about it so much, or feel that you have within your grasp, within your power, the ability to look up stuff yourself. Just the other day, I was at a conference and I picked up this guide here. It's from Pearson, who I've done some consulting work for in the past. They're a really good, organization. And I don't know if you've heard of the CEFR. It's the Common European Framework of Reference, where you have a level of English, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. C2 is the highest, A1 is the lowest. You've probably all heard of this before, many of you have. And Pearson, they're advertising now something called the Global Scale of English, which is kind of, I guess you could say, not a competitor, but another option, which to look up what your English level is. You can just look up GSE online. It's quite nice. There's lots of research that goes into it. But I picked up this guide because it's the global scale of English specifically for academic English. And there's one thing that caught my attention, is that at the very end here, the last page, whereas the highest level, for the global scale of English and academic English in writing, they say that at C2, which is the most advanced level, then at this level, you can write an effective and correctly formatted research paper. Only at C2 can you be able to write an effective and correctly formatted research paper. And as much as I like Pearson, and I think that they do good work, I think that is a notion that I want people to get away from, that they have to be at a really high advanced level of English in order to produce a research paper. Obviously, there are very few people who are here now and watching this broadcast right now who are at a C2 level. It's actually, if you look at it statistically, it's under 2% of the Brazilian population that has a C2 level. But obviously, there's a much higher percentage of people who need to publish a research paper now, even if they're not at C2. So part of last week was not to teach you how to write correct English, but to give yourselves the tools to start writing correct English already now, even if your English is not at a C2 level. And so we're going to quickly go over the homework, and then we're going to talk about some of that one aspect of the tools that we mentioned last week, the ANT-CONC, and a few more thoughts about what constitutes correct English, some things that are important in that regard. And then the biggest part of today is going to be focusing on some important factors to consider when you are conceptualizing or conceiving of how to write, who you're writing for. Now, this first part, the correction of the grammar, I want you to remember that you can always count on CAPA, people at CAPA, to help you with that, with the grammar, but especially asking questions about anything to do with this class. So even though I'm going to go quickly through the grammar homework, remember that you can go to the website, and there's a button there to Agendar Atendimento, and you can always click on that and book with one of these people here, or one of the another person who's not here. Oh, there she is. And also other people within CAPA to say, hey, I don't understand this grammar point, or could you clarify this for me? They're there to help, right? Okay. So, quickly, one of the exercises was about analysis of variance. And I gave you the example last week of piece of cake, and how you have to be careful when you have constructions in Portuguese with of, because you have to think, okay, is this something of something in English, or is it just two nouns together? And João gave me a really good example today of a way to remember how it can make a difference. One is a glass of wine, the other one is a wine glass. And just remember, which one would you prefer to have? Just a wine glass or a glass of wine? Well, clearly, many of us, it's the latter. So you can make a big difference. So that was the correct one, analysis of variance. Now, if you Googled this, you probably did find variance analysis. Many of you did Google this. But there is a difference between variance analysis and analysis of variance, where many of you know who have taken statistics classes or know about statistics, that analysis of variance is a very specific statistic used to look at the analysis of variance within means. Whereas variance analysis, apparently, I'm not really familiar with this, is something that's used in the accounting area. I'm not sure. But anyway, what I want to say, and this is something to keep in mind, is that my purpose last week, my objective was for you to have an awareness of these issues, an awareness that if you are writing in Portuguese a noun, in Portuguese, noun de noun, that in English you have to be careful to see if it's an of construction or two nouns construction, and also passive voice and the other ones that I gave you last week. Awareness that of these issues, these broader issues. And that was the word of the day, the first one. Also, I showed you how Google Translate can help. So in this case, you can see that Google Translate did a pretty good job of getting that question correct. That there is enough data within Google to say this is the most probable translation and it is correct. But you can also do further detective work and find, okay, you have analysis of variance, which has nearly 2 million results in Google, whereas variance analysis has 170,000. Does that mean it's wrong? No. But it does send a signal, it should send a signal that, oh, maybe one is more broadly used, or maybe one is used more in more specific contexts. It should set off a red flag. And then I also recommended the use of &conc with your own do-it-yourself corpora, your specialized corpora, because then you can also look up things like this and say, okay, which one in my area, specific area, is most used? Variance analysis or analysis of variance? And most likely, in most of the research areas, you're going to find that this is going to be more common. Whereas here you have 82, in a small corpus that I have, 82, and if you compare that with variance analysis, there's only one. And if you look at that one, it's written by non-native speakers, which in itself is not a bad thing, but it does say something like, okay, well, you can think this one here is maybe the one that's most widely used. Okay. Another example is confidence interval. You have this another statistical term, not interval of confidence. It's over 2 million hits with that, whereas interval of confidence only has 5,000. If you look at &conc, you see a bunch of hits, 17, whereas nobody says interval of confidence. It's a specific term. Okay. Another one, another example, tempo de armazenamento. The same thing, where Google recommended, the translator recommended storage time, not time of storage. Both would be possible in actuality. In reality, you could say time of storage and storage time. But again, our objective here is to thinking of the reader. Always be thinking of the reader. Which one is going to cause less distraction? Which one is going to meet with the most success of immediate comprehension? And storage time, according to Google, statistically, it shows that it's more, they're more. Same here, you see 780,000 or 779,000 versus 32,000. So really, detective work. A lot of times, it's just your own editing of your own work. It's going to require a little bit of detective work with the awareness of those main issues that I brought up last week, the noun plus noun combinations, the adverb combinations, the passive voice, those things that I mentioned last week. These are for the larger issues. Remember that I gave you other tools. I recommended other tools for the smaller things, like prepositions and articles. So here you have the adverb thing, and the correct one is move the object carefully. You could also say to carefully move the object. But what you can't say, or at least not say without sounding a bit strange, is to move carefully the object. That one differs from the most common way of adverb position in English. And so, in Portuguese, you can say these kinds of things without violating rules too much. So you have, as an example, eu tomo café, and that is a fact. I do. I really, really do. And in English, the same thing. Now, here's an adverb. Many of you didn't know that. It's okay if you can admit that you didn't know that simply was an adverb, but it simply is an adverb of frequency. And just in case you don't remember, it rarely modifies a noun, but in Portuguese, you cannot say ever, I drink always coffee. That sounds really strange in English. If you say, eu tomo sempre café, you can hear that some people might say that, even though it's not the most usual position. So it's this position here that's a real violation of what sounds normal or most usual in English. You sound a bit like Yoda. Foi importante mover cuidadoso o objeto, and if you look at it, Google Translate has carefully there in a correct position. So be aware of adverb position in your writing. Affected the data, partially affected the data. That's the correct one. Not affected partially the data, or data partially affected, obviously. And you could use, and conc would give you the same answer. You could see that where the most usual position of partially is. Again, awareness. Being aware that an adverb, you have to be careful of its position. Scale was another tool that I recommended. You could find the same information here. A little bit of detective work, a little bit of patience. All right. Then passive voice was another one I mentioned. Very common for someone to write. A lot of Brazilians, but not only Brazilians, will write, were analyzed socio-demographic data. Always the passive construction comes at the end. And the same thing with are, was used. And this one with the prepositions, you could find that information quite easily in and conc. And many of you mentioned this in your homework in formative. A lot of you mentioned that you use the collocation tool, and I just want to quickly show you that now, sort of live, so to demonstrate that, because I didn't teach you that last time. I wanted you to learn how to use the corpus first, but just very quickly. Here is and conc, and I'm going to load a corpus that I have. Now to load a bunch of files, you can do a Control-Alt or Control-A. because I have 191 for some reason. It's supposed to be 192 in this. And then I'm going to put the word based here, because I want to know if it's based on or based in, based of, and then I'll click start. And the first screen here, this is called keyword in context, with based as a node word. And you can simply look at its behavior there. But you can also look at what's called collocates. First, you have to generate a word list. And I'll go back to collocates. And what you do if you just click start, you see just this here, which shows you the most common ones with a frequency that go with based. However, you can change the span. So let's say that I only want to know the words on the right of based, and so then I won't have anything on the left, and I just want the word immediately to the right. So this is the left side word, and this is the right side. So I only want to know what's the word, the preposition that immediately follows based. And I put here just one position to the right. And I click start again. Oops. And I want to sort by frequency, sorry. Not by stat, by frequency. And then I see on is the most common, then upon is the next one. And then to find out more about these particular prepositions and how they're used, you can simply click on this and you see all the examples of based with on. So that's another way that you can, do a little detective work and find out more information, grammatical information. So that is the correct answer. Okay, I asked you to create a corpus, and many of you did. And a couple of comments that I found interesting. This one here, experiencia. Well, I'll let you read this. Your Portuguese is better than mine. And I found this to be really interesting because one thing that corpus tools are very good at is either confirming suspicions or assumptions that you have about the language, but also it can also show you, based on evidence, things that you didn't, or go counter to your assumptions or your assumptions or your presuppositions. In this case, the person saw that actually timber wood was more used than timber. And maybe that is an important thing in that area. The same thing here. Well, actually, here's one with grammar. And so the person, through using the concordance feature that I just showed you, saw that is released from. Again, this can make, maybe it seems something small to you, maybe just a small preposition, but it can make a difference. In many cases, a big difference. Just like a glass of wine in a wine glass. So, I recommend the use of these tools. You can see these comments online. There are some really good comments from people that I recommend look. But I want to get back to something that was brought up on the first day of this class, which is going back to the influence or the importance of English and the whole discussion about native speakers of English and what is correct. And remember that I showed you this map here, that is sort of a general world population map, but I also showed you one which shows you proportionally the representation of published science according to region, where you have hyperinflated examples of, for example, North America and Western Europe, East Asia, and then you have these really emaciated regions like Africa, and even to some extent South America. And the point of showing this was to say, well, look, the native speakers, being of an English-speaking country, can help. It does seem to correlate to some degree to successful publication in international journals, but the origins of that, or what causes that, is a different thing altogether. And what there is a debate about, or there's a growing awareness of in published scientific research, is the contribution of non-native speakers of English to research. That they are now more and more becoming equal contributors to knowledge, and not so much from only English-speaking countries, whereas you had for a long time the United States and even Britain dominating the publication, scientific publications in the world. Nowadays you have people from all over, and many of those places are not places where English is the first language. Brad Cattrew, he proposed a model which is a bit controversial, in categorizing countries into three spheres: the inner circle, the outer circle, and the expanding circle. And so according to Cattrew, the inner circle are countries like the United States, Great Britain, Australia. And you see all of the authors are from USP or Campinas, or also Instituto Federal de Rio de Janeiro and Embrapa, so all Brazilian. And in this abstract there are a couple of mistakes. Can you identify at least one mistake? I'll give you 20 seconds to try to identify a mistake in this abstract. Did you identify any mistakes? Now, there are a couple of mistakes that even if you don't know English grammar, you should be able to catch. For example, here, in addition, it is important, the evaluation of intrinsic quality grounded on the self-life is also essential. What? You have, is it important or is it essential? You have important and essential describing the same thing in the same sentence. Why did that happen? You might think one possible explanation is people sometimes make mistakes in English that they wouldn't make in Portuguese, for example, because you're so focused on getting the individual words right, for example, that you don't look to see if the whole sentence makes sense. So that's common. People tend to revise less. They tend to edit their work less in English than they do in Portuguese or whatever their first language is. Because partly, as people say, they get through writing an article in English and they're so tired, they're so glad that it's finished that they don't want to go back and look at it again. But here is an example of something that's not a grammar mistake. It's just, you have competing, well, there's partly a grammar mistake, but you have competing adjectives. But there's something else here. Did you notice added of? And that's a direct translation, I think, from Portuguese, like adicionado de or something. And there's another one like that here, which is proportion. The word proportionate exists in English, but it means something closer to proportional, not proporcionar, which I think is what they're trying to say here. And there is something else which is even more subtle here, which probably none of you noticed, which is in this context. Think for a second. All of you have probably written this before and seen it many times in Portuguese. Nesse contexto, nesse contexto. But it's not something that native speakers write. And it doesn't have the same feeling in English as it does in Portuguese. Yet, as I'm going to show you today, there's a lot of evidence that it's being more and more accepted as being just part of academic English because of the expanding circle influence in academic English. So let's look at some of these here. So I asked you to read this article here, especially in the last years. And these were the research questions. Is there evidence that non-native speaking or non-native forms of academic English are entering published research articles? If so, how generalizable is that evidence? And is there evidence that it's increasing? So I looked at 8 different food science journals. The reason why food science journals, I was preparing something for a food science program here. And I started noticing some interesting constructions, and it sort of piqued my curiosity. I also like food science because it's kind of a very transdisciplinary field. So I took 2 periods, those there. I sampled different editions, always 2 articles written by natives for every year and 2 from non-natives. And so we had a total of 384, 192 native, 192 non-native, and a total corpus size of 2.17 million words. These are the journals. So as you can see with these journals here, they're all international, either from the United States, United Kingdom, or the Netherlands, because Elsevier is in the Netherlands. And these are their impact things like food chemistry and food policy and so on. These were the countries, these were the authors that produced the articles in the native speaker corpus. So predominantly the United States, roughly reflecting the distribution of the influence in this area. And you can see there's a much greater range of countries of non-native speakers, starting with Spain for some reason, but there you have it. Many different ones, 32 total, I think. So here are the words that were noticed by the corpus as being very different. In other words that native speakers didn't use very much, but non-native speakers did tend to use. The first one being researches, because researches is in English research is an uncountable noun. You can say, in Portuguese, you can say pesquisa, meaning a general word, and you can say pesquisas, meaning individual studies. But that's the way we say it in English. We say research as a general area, and then to refer to specific ones, we say studies, usually. But as you can see, statistically speaking, there was nothing in the native author corpus in all those millions of words. But you see examples from authors from Spain, Brazil, China, Serbia, and in 2 UK journals, 3 UK journals, and 1 Dutch journal of those. So 2 out of 3, 3 out of 3, 1 out of 2. Another example, prove. I'm not saying that, I have to be clear here, I'm not saying that these are bad or good. I'm saying this is what the evidence is saying. And what it's saying is that you have some versions of prove, and you have some evidence of prove in the native speaker corpus, but you have many more people writing the word prove in the non-native corpus. This catches my attention a little bit because you hear reports of people being discouraged from using the word prove. You do see the word comprovar a lot in Portuguese articles. Blah, 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 comprova que. But that word, for people who recommend how to write in English, they often say don't use prove because it sounds too strong. Say, well, show or suggest, but not prove. Yet you see that there is some acceptance, a growing acceptance of this word, apparently. And you see this in Spanish authors, Greek authors, Chinese authors, Italian, Taiwanese, Colombian. in American and British journals. Another one, nowadays. This is a word that I used to correct all the time because it sounded funny to me. It sounded very conversational. Yet, you see that there is one native that used it, but there's a far greater number of something that's common among non-native speakers. Another one, works. Again, I'm thinking in Portuguese here that you can say trabalhos. It's quite common to talk about trabalhos in Portuguese. Yet in English, it used to be that you would never find this in research articles. Work was, either referred to as research or studies, or work as a whole without pluralizing. But a pluralized version of work was actually quite rare. And now you see that you have 10 hits in the American corpus, or rather the native corpus, but 60 hits in the non-native. And attested in several different countries, several different journals. Another one, besides, to start a sentence. And I think that Brazilians often use this, or non-native speakers often use this as a kind of, in Portuguese, the version would be something like além disso. But this além disso is not something that native speakers use to say. They don't use besides. They'll use something like moreover or furthermore. But that doesn't mean that they're correct and this is not. I'm saying that this is what non-native speakers do use often besides as a way of saying what you say, além disso. And it's in just about every country that was analyzed. And it is in all the journals. Like I mentioned before, in this context, you have a very high number of hits in the non-native corpus, not so much in the native corpus. And the way it seems to be used for you guys, the Brazilians use it, when they use nesse contexto, they mean something like thus and therefore, or in the light of this. But that's not how we use it in American English, for example. It is well known that, I like this. I like this as a kind of substitute for, I'm not going to cite anybody. It is well known that is just very well known. But it's something that is more common in non-native corpus than native corpus. Don't know why. And here is the most important thing. What this shows, this graph, is that you have a trend of growth. In many cases, statistically significant growth, measuring chi-squared. On all these words, there has been an increase in all these terms in the last 10 years. There's been an increase. So what does that say? It does say that the expanding circle and us in Brazil, you are all making a contribution to academic English, and so what is correct should be rethought. And it also says, and it should say, that since there's an increasing acceptance of these non-native terms, the non-native way of saying things, what it could signal is that possibly a lot of the reviewers themselves are non-native speakers, and so they don't even notice anymore things that may sound a bit funny. It could be also that there's so many non-native speakers contributing to English language publication science that it's looking normal now. It's looking just sort of acceptable. But the most important thing is that this is not what causes rejection. Using a wrong word, wrong phrase, is not what's causing rejection. In the end, what seems to matter is when a good study is written, and if the English is understandable, as you can see the evidence for your articles, and you're planning to write. I don't want you to get so hung up on prepositions and articles, a and the, and passive voice and all of that. I want you to worry about that later. I want you to think about bigger issues first. Because as you can see, what is correct, that can be looked at later. You can consider that afterwards. That's important, but not the first thing you should think about. You should be thinking about bigger issues. And so the rest of today, I'm going to talk about what are those bigger issues? What should you be thinking about? The first thing I want you to consider, I wanted you to look at was this video. And I like to use this video, I don't know if you watch this, because it shows the process of what someone goes through when they're writing. I'll try to play a little bit for you now. It's only a minute long.
Okay, what should I put here? I suppose I could just say hello. Actually, I should probably make that hello from Lev. Okay.
Sorry, you can't really hear this. So this guy's writing to a woman he met at a bar. And he erased what he wrote and he's changing it. And he's changing the phrase and he's changing it again. And he's thinking about strategically what's going to cause the effect that he wants. Now he's thinking about how to end it. Too forward. Too polite. Too traditional. No. Perfect. But would you like to hang out as a yes or no question? That sounds too needy. That sounds confident enough and friendly enough, and so he sends it. The reason I like to show that video, and I think it's a good example of how he was changing his phrases, had nothing to do with correct or not correct. He wasn't worried about prepositions or adverb order. He was thinking about the effect that he was going to have on his reader, in this case, Mimi. He was thinking about how can I word this, what phraseology can I use, what vocabulary can I use to achieve my goal. In this case, to have a conversation again with Mimi. Who knows, maybe eventually marry her. That's his goal. How can I make sure that I write this in such a way that my message meets with success? And that's what you should be thinking of when you're writing your article, when you're planning your article. It's not, am I going to write this correctly or not? But how can I word this in such a way that it is likely to meet with success? And I also like this video because you see that he's not just writing. There's a lot going on in his head as he's writing. And he changes all the time. You probably have done this before many times in Portuguese. And what does it depend on? It usually depends on how important the message is. Even if you're writing a WhatsApp message sometimes. Like, okay, well, I got to be careful how I write this because for whatever reason, the circumstance requires it to be especially well worded so you don't offend someone or whatever. The same thing with an email. Just yesterday I wrote an email that probably had 25 words in it, but I was thinking about how I was going to word it because it involved somebody from whom I want money, basically. So I had to be very, very careful about how I worded this. And so it's not about correct so much, it's about the desired effect. How can you achieve that desired effect? And thinking about broader issues, not individual words or correct grammar necessarily. That can come later. So this is your framework when you're thinking about broader issues. You know, one of the frameworks is this IMRAD, Introduction, Method, Results, and Discussion. But one question is, where do you start? Which section should you start with? The introduction, the method, the result, discussion, or somewhere else? I'd like you to go into Kahoot. So this is kahoot.it, kahoot.it. And you're going to put in Just a second. Just a minute. You're going to classic. Right. You're going to put in this code 365503. And there is a delay for people who are watching this online, so we're going to wait a little bit longer today than we did last week. You can be creative with the names you put in, just don't be offensive. That must be my orientanda. Carnage. Cucurucucu. Fora Temer. Lula 13. Yeah, political propaganda, I guess that's okay. Ron. Amélie Poulain. Bob Construtor. Lula preso. Okay. So I'm going to show you this question in a second, and when I do, you feel free to talk to the person sitting next to you if you like about the answer to this question. If you're watching this, if you have colleagues around you you can talk to, that's fine. You can talk to them too. If not, just think about the question. You're going to take the time, a few minutes or a few seconds at least, to think about the question and discuss it if you like with a person close to you. All right. Think I can go? Here we go. So in your opinion, where should you start an article? In the IMRAD, where should you start an article? Okay, sorry, that was faster than I thought it was going to be. And most people, at least of that sample there, most people chose method. And what I'm going to suggest to you today is that actually I'd like you to consider that what is often the best driver of your article is in the results section. The method section is, of course, very important to start your research. But what drives the article is often your data. It's the results. And I'll explain to you why. Oh, there's still answers coming in, but I think it's pretty much the same. Oops. So this author here, Joshua Schimmel, he has this book here, Writing Science, which I recommend. He talks about in the book how he started publishing a number of articles in high-impact journals, but he realized at some point that, in fact, he was telling the story wrong. That there was a problem with the narrative in his stories. And what he says is, this is his recommendation. You should start with your data. Why? Because he says that the story that you tell actually grows organically from the data. And then he says when you run into problems is when the author knows the story they want to tell before they collect the data. And this is something that is quite common in the graduate level, master's level, and the doctoral level, is that you enter a program already thinking about what you want to do and what results you'd like to achieve. And that's a story that you want to tell in your article. But in fact, if you don't let the data speak for you, there are some problems that can come up, and I'll explain, and I'll show you what those are, those problems. You should always let the data tell the story. Let the data speak. In fact, the use of the passive voice and the use of the third person in science is one way that traditionally science has done that, so that it's not you talking, it's the research talking. It's not you talking, it's the data talking. So that's his recommendation. Start with the results section. Now, a lot of you, half of you, in fact, don't have data collected. And we're going to talk about next week some ways that you can get around that. But before we talk about that next week, you're all going to receive an email. One of the students in this class, Juliana Kaminsky, from the health area, Saúde, she has a very large study that she's offered to share the data from that study with anybody who's interested. And you'll receive an email with her email to get in touch if you want to use her data, which has already been analyzed with SPSS, for example, if you need data for an article. And if anybody else in this room or watching right now has data like that they'd like to share, please let me know. Is there anything you want to add to that, or? No? Okay. So IMRAD, in the IMRAD structure, results is often what drives the story, drives the narrative, directly starting from the introduction. You have your results, but how are you going to contextualize those results, your research? All of you have seen, many of you have seen at least, that in PDF, you have this section, this navigation menu on the side of a PDF. Here you see that this, in my article that you read last week, you have an IMRAD structure with special attention to the methods section. There's subsections there, where I talk about the corpus and I talk about the procedure with great care. Why did I spend extra attention here in the methods section? Because I was already considering a person called a naysayer, who you're going to hear his name again. The naysayer is the guy who, or woman, who, the imaginary woman or guy who's reading your paper and who you think about when you're writing your paper, because you know that the naysayer, this woman or this man, might have a question about your data, might have a question about why you chose this method. And so you anticipate the doubts, you anticipate the possible criticisms that the naysayer had. So this method section is kind of more developed because of that. But I started with the results, which drove the introduction to contextualize the study. And these authors here, Graff and Birkenstein, they break the argument structure in academic English into something very simple to remember. They say, I say. I like this as a good mnemonic, as a good way to remember how to structure, how to construct your arguments. It's like first starting with what they say, they being the other people who have researched in your area, so that you can say, okay, now this is what I'm saying. This is what they say, and now this is what I say. And another way to put that is, as you all know, the research world is a kind of conversation. And you have to talk about what is the conversation that you are entering? What is the conversation in your area that you're entering so that you can talk about your contribution to that conversation? And so what they say is a writer needs to indicate not only what his or her thesis is or contribution, but also what larger conversation that thesis is in response to. What larger conversation your research is in response to. And you'll see that a lot of authors don't do that. When it comes to, sorry, there's a mistake there. When it comes to constructing an argument, remember that you are entering a conversation and therefore need to start with what others are saying. This very basic step, when you're considering how to write your article, this very basic step is one that many people skip, many people miss. What is the conversation that you're entering? And this is very important in order to create a space for your research so that the importance of your research is brought to the fore. You can say that there are two kind of aims, two layers of aims when you're beginning to think your writing. One is the aim of your study, your objective, the one that you entered your program with, your doctoral program, your research, your master's program. The other one's a more personal one. You all should have a personal aim when you're writing. The specific aim is, you state that in the article itself. The objective of this research is to whatever. That's the specific aim. That's one that everybody knows. But the personal aim is often something that only you know. An example of personal aim is, first of all, what is the conversation that you want to enter? What is the area? What is the debate? What is the part of the conversation that you yourself want to be noticed in, that you want to be associated with, that you are responding to? And that's a personal aim. Also, another personal aim is, what do you want the article to do for you? In other words, do you want this article to build your reputation in this particular area, or do you want this article to show that you align yourself theoretically with a particular argument or otherwise? You have to think about your both aims when you begin to write, but especially what conversation that you want to enter and why. And that is the driver of how you pick your journal. That should be one driver. Not is it A2, A1, B2, B1, but your objectives. What do you want the article to do for you is one way to help you pick a journal. So as I mentioned, the results or data should help you drive the introduction, begin your story, because this guy here, the naysayer, he exists. You cannot assume that the person who's going to read your research likes you. Even your own advisors. You cannot assume that the person who's going to receive your manuscript is going to immediately say, yes, I agree 100% with everything this person is saying. No. This person here, the naysayer, he exists in the peer reviewers that the journal editors send the manuscripts to. He exists even after it's published, but there's a pre-published readers that you really have to be concerned with. And the naysayer, he's there reading word after word, line after line, and saying, wait a minute, why did the person do this? Wait a minute, that seems like an overconfident assertion that the person is making. Wait a minute, this method is not justified. Wait a minute, they didn't mention this in the introduction. And so on. The naysayer, he's there. And you have to keep him in mind when you're writing. So as I said, the naysayer helped me think about, okay, I better carefully word my method. And if you read my method section, you see that I justify everything. Because I know that naysayer could have been there. And this is one of the few articles that I've written where they just said, fine, don't change anything, it's good. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the abstract of this article and how already the abstract is where you should start one place where you can start thinking about how you're contextualizing your research, what conversation you're entering. I'd like you to read just the first, read this abstract, but tell me, after you read it, where do I signal? Where do I tell the reader I am contributing to the existing conversation? At what point, what words in this abstract do I say, and this is my contribution? Have you seen it? If you identified this, that would be really the first place where it's signaled. Already in the first sentence, I'm saying this is the conversation, while the number of research articles written by non-native speakers of English and published in English media rise, this is the conversation. Little is known about the extent to which that trend may be affecting the way English is used. So I'm saying, hey, we don't know enough about this. Already, the person who sees this is, okay, we know this is what they say. What is he saying? What's the new thing? What's the novelty here? Yeah, that's true. We don't know. We don't know about this thing. So there's a gap. The earlier you're able to say this to the reader, the better. So they can say, why am I reading this manuscript? Why should I publish this? What's new? Another way to say this is that this green area here is where I establish territory. This is the conversation, the territory that has already been prepared before. And then I establish a niche, my space. The territory is here, and here is my niche. And John Swales and colleagues, they developed a concept for this they called CARS, which is create a research space. That authors, when they talk about the conversation, when they talk about territory, they are then creating a space for their research. They're creating a research space for their study. And that CARS, that creating of a research space, happens in the introduction. And the earlier you signal it, the earlier you're able to say what your niche is, what your space is, the better. So, sorry, this is supposed to be 1, 2, and 3, but it's not because it's in PowerPoint and not the other one. It's not very well formatted, and I don't want to confuse you. That's better. A little bit better. So this is considered, whoops. So this is considered move 1, move 2, and move 3. Establishing territory, establishing niche, and then occupying the territory, or occupying the niche, move 3. Yes. The second half of the chamada is lingua franca. Lingua franca. Now, you may notice that in the articles you read, that a lot of them have this already in the abstract. Some of them don't. This is not to say that you have to have this in order to publish your article. Just to say that the clearer this is, especially in empirical research articles, the clearer this is, the better in terms of saying, here's what's my contribution to the conversation. Move 1, establishing territory. Move 2, establishing a niche. And move 3, occupying the niche. So move 1, mention importance, what the conversation is, niche, mentioning the gap, occupying to say how that gap will be filled. Okay? Pretty simple, yet pretty powerful often for you to think about how you're going to deliver your message in the introduction using something like this. Here's an example. I don't know if some of you are gamers here, but here's an article called "The More You Play, the More Aggressive You Become." And immediately in the abstract, you can see the authors follow this. Sometimes it's not signaled in an obvious way, but here, let's see if you can identify where move 2 is. Where do they talk about a niche? So the first sentence is move 1. It's the territory, that's the conversation. This is well established. But in the second one, they say, well, you know, we know about short-term effects, but we don't know a lot about the long-term effects. So, there you have a move 2. Very simple, but they make it very clear. Now, here's the abstract that we looked at last week, where remember they're translating this usuários de álcool e outras drogas and pesquisa exploratória de campo. We talked about this last week, but from a linguistic perspective, translation perspective. Now, I'd like you to look at this from a cars perspective. Is this abstract clear in terms of cars? Do the authors create a research space in a clear way? What do you guys think? Do you see cars? Is it clear? Not really. What do you see stand out there? You see method and results. You see, if you're looking at this like an IMRAD, you'd see methods and results here. The authors talk about what they did. They talk about interesting findings. But what's not so clear is what conversation they're entering. Why the study was important to begin with. Is there a lack? They say apontan lacunas. Did we not know this before? Probably not. But you can't assume that the editor is going to know that, or that the reviewer of the article is going to know that. That simple thing, that very first territory, is missing here. They haven't said what the conversation they're responding to is. And so I also ask you to read this article, it's written by a Brazilian researcher who I've met. And she is based in the United States now, but she does a lot of research related to Brazilians and their article writing and other academic genres. And she analyzed articles, introductions of articles in two journals that could be compared of the same area. In one area that's called English for Specific Purposes. One version of the journal that was a Brazilian journal, another version that was an American one. And she wanted to see if there was a difference between the way Brazilians structure their articles compared to in the Brazilian journals compared to the international journals, or the American one. And here's what she found. So that's the first interesting finding, that 7 out of the 10 introductions didn't have a move to. The authors hadn't created a research space for themselves. And here's another interesting finding. The most common sequence in the Brazilian corpus was move 1 and move 3. Establishing territory and then occupying a niche, but without not saying what the niche was. In other words, not making it clear where the research space is. Here you see the Brazilian patterns. Which number is missing here? Two only appears in a few of them. The rest, they skip that. Compare that with the American journal. I think it's American, but non-Brazilian journal, international journal. And look, all of them have 2. They all do. They all have move 2. One obvious implication of this is, if you're publishing internationally, you need to think about what your move 2 is. It's important. These are the rating criteria for a journal that I review for the TESOL Quarterly. And of all these questions, I talked about this before, how they don't focus on English language. That's not the important thing. What they do focus on, the very first thing is, does the manuscript contain new and significant information to justify publication? Many manuscripts do, but if you have to find it and you have to dig for it, that's not good. It should be clearly signaled by the author, and that's move 2. Right there. So, this is your homework. There's an article on the website I'll show you in a minute called Quantifying the Burden of Writing Research Articles. And read the introduction, or you can read the entire article actually because it's interesting, but read especially the introduction. There's a question about it on Go Formative. But also notice if you can hear the authors addressing a naysayer in the text. You're going to hear this name again in this course about the naysayer. And it's good if you already have an awareness of this person. You can begin to hear the authors talking to this naysayer who is in the text. So this article, generally speaking, the articles that I refer to in this class you'll find online. The exception was the article that I sent you, this especially in the last year's article, because there's an embargo by the publisher that once it's published, you have to wait 3 years in order for it to be published online. It's just the way it is. But most of the time, you'll find this online. And so this article, this How Now an Englander one, you can find right here. There. On our class page right here. Okay, any questions I should bring up or anything? No? Yeah, sorry about the internet connection that happened. We lost that in the middle of the class. And are we confirmed for next week at the auditorium? Oh yeah, so a couple of things to, first of all, this class will be in our old auditorium, the Daga auditorium next week, the first auditorium that we met, be next week. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I'm pretty sure that's what I've been told. And the other thing is that many people have asked me about, well, a number of questions, but first of all, the assignments on formative, when are they due? And some of you, I was in a conference in Japan, and so I missed the first class, or I was in Switzerland skiing, and sorry, I missed the first couple of classes, whatever it is. I basically assume that in the first couple of weeks, people are still kind of getting their bearings in this class. They're still kind of trying to understand the systems and everything. And so I've left, you can still go online and do it. The Go Formative assignments are open from week 1 and week 2 still. But starting next week, in other words, Wednesday next week, those will be closed. Formative 1, Module 1, Module 2, and Module 3 will close on Wednesday next week. In other words, you will have 1 week, you'll have 7 days. 7 days. you have 7 days from the time that the assignment has been given to finish the assignment. And of course, individual problems, you can talk to them and you can work it out. And that's it. Is that it for the messages? All right. Thank you very much. See you next week.